Okay, so good evening from Raleigh, North Carolina, or whenever you're going to be watching this. And it is the federally recognized holiday of Thanksgiving. Um, it's being considered, if you will, a federal holiday here in the United States since 1863 when Abraham Lincoln declared it. And he actually did it. Um, you know, after Gettysburg, and then, of course, later on, the Gettysburg Address. Um, Technically, it's actually an older holiday as a federal holiday than Christmas. But anyway, I wanted to talk about that. And just in case you're wondering, um, my children are in another state at this moment, so I'm actually alone. I'm actually alone with their cat. No Thanksgiving dinner for Dino Bryant, the DLB. But with that being said, I definitely wanted to get into that and talk about it. In regards to Thanksgiving. Now, you may also be familiar with another term, you know, kind of a protest, if you will, observance, and that is the National Day of Mourning. Um, Basically making the argument that Thanksgiving, or at least the first Thanksgiving, was pretty close to the beginning of the end. I guess you could even make the argument that maybe it was even earlier. Um, so, um, of course, when we look at Thanksgiving, oftentimes what do we talk about? We talk about the Native Americans, in this case, the Wampanoags, who had, taught, if you will, the Pilgrims a great deal in regards to farming the land and, you know, tilling it, and, so on and so forth. And of course, you may be familiar with Tisquantum or Squanto, who kind of was an intermediary guide. Um, and how they basically broke bread after the harvest, right? Um, and we don't have a lot of information in regards from the Wampanoags. There's few records, written records from them. Um, I would say that largely speaking, that's probably more or less kind of what happened. But the argument has been, well, well, I've heard people just basically said it was a lie altogether, and you have to be careful about that. But I would definitely say, hey, there is certainly more to the story, right? Because it was basically like, okay, well, we basically had this wonderful, if you will, dinner, and that's the end. We all walk hand in hand, and obviously there is certainly a great deal more to the story. Obviously, there was issues with fighting, not getting along, um, broken treaties. There was a 1621 treaty that the Pilgrims had hoped, if you will, that the had hoped that the Wampanoags would sign. I also want to be clear on this because I'm not sure if there's, I'm not sure how clear you were taught about, if you will, these colonies as well. Okay, so um, the Plymouth colony, and I'll try to be brief on this. Um, you have a first Plymouth colony that basically takes off roughly around the time, actually slightly before, what would become known as the Jamestown colony. At the time, it was actually called the London colony. Um, and then, of course, you have this Plymouth colony. But that first Plymouth colony goes to Maine. Um, there's a combination of basically people being freezing to death, if you forgive me, and also their stores, the storage, their food basically being burned, you know, um, that building being burned. Um, they actually try to scrap, if you will, this colony. Then, of course, you have your London colony, which will become the Jamestown colony. And then they go back at it, right? In 1621, when they arrive. Um, in this case, in this circumstance, not in Bangor, Maine, where the original one was, but if you will, to Plymouth. If you ever look at a map, you know the Chin portion of Massachusetts, that's basically where the Plymouth colony was. Now, also keep in mind that there will be a colony later, which is a very important colony. It's actually the one that kind of replaces things. The Massachusetts Bay Colony. That's actually a later colony, 1629, 1630. Doing this off the top of my head, I believe that's correct. All right. But at any rate, there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. Now, one of them is that the Wampanoags from the get-go were struggling, if you will, with European contact. Numerous Native Americans had died from smallpox. You probably know that. I'm not sure if you know this, but the Wampanoags had contact with other Europeans um, before, if you will, the second Plymouth colony. And in 16, I believe it's 1614. Feel free to double check me on these. But in 1614, we think about two-thirds of that tribe, two-thirds of that nation actually died from, um, had actually died from yellow fever. And so already from the get-go, they were already in pretty rough shape. Now, of course, eventually you get into 1621, where there's a Thanksgiving. There's also one in 1623. There's a few of them. It's also important to keep in mind that after, if you will, them breaking bread, not long after, things get rough again. The Plymouth colony is, if you will, reneging on contracts, if you will, treaties, taking land. Um, and I think it is fair to say that even during this great Thanksgiving, um, they're not really doing this as equals. Um, that is not the goal, if you will, of this Plymouth colony. That's not their goal. Their goal is to um, basically settle this area, um, you know, in Massachusetts, um, and anyone who's around them. you know, so that's important to keep in mind. So they're not on equal footing. Um, Now, also, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are a series of what we would probably call Indian wars or Native American wars. I'm actually reading Paul Andrew Hutton, a former professor of mine, his book, The Undiscovered Country, and he talks about obviously this concern about using that term. Um, and obviously, we've been talking about that for decades now in regards to using that term. So there's a series of Indian wars that or Native American wars that that I certainly talk about. Um, my goodness. Let's see, 1621, Thanksgiving. 1623, actually 1622, you do have a Native American attack. And that attack is happening because, if you will, the people in Jamestown keep taking land, if you will, from the Native Americans, and they attack. And so 1623, there is, if you will, a revenge attack by Captain William Tucker, where, he basically gets a doctor, a physician, to develop a poison which kills hundreds, if you will, of Native Americans during a toast um, in the Powhatan Confederacy. Um, and in the end, and then they kill others through, if you will, more violent means, um, gunshots, things of that nature. Well, that's 1623. Um, in my classes, you know, um, what I would do is I would teach about that. I would teach about the Pequot War, in the 1630s. I want to say 1634. Feel free to double check. I'm doing all this off the top of my head. Um, where the Pequots, now, admittedly, with other Native Americans, tribes, possibly intimidated um, by the settlers, but nevertheless, they basically wiped the Pequots, if you will, off the map in 1634. Supposedly there were some pirates that were killed, and they blamed the Pequots for these pirates being killed. And there may be some other things that had come into play, and I'm just not thinking about them. And also, there's greed as well. And so they're basically wiped off the map, although you will see actually Pequots today, and people are trying to figure out how that happened, since numbers of them were sold into slavery. But and then back to the Wampanoags. Actually, you know what? You can go before that. There's some a series of battles, if you will, in what would be New Netherland, then eventually New York colony, and then New York State. You have this series of battles where there were sneak attacks on the part of, if you will, um, settlers. The Dutch settlers in New York or New Netherland. Then back to the Wampanoags in 1675 with the King Philip's War. King Philip's War is actually named for Chief Metacomet, who's a Wampanoag chief. And there's some question of why they call them this, the settlers and the British. One argument had been that they called him King Philip's because he wore Western clothes. And it gets kind of confusing because apparently King Philip didn't like the West or didn't like Europeans, um, and handled his own people strictly, um, because, if you will, of them going, if you will, along with settlers, going to, I suppose, what it will be known at the time as, I think it is known now at the time, or it's known now, but at the time as well. It didn't originally have this name, but Harvard, they were like, why on earth are you going to Harvard? Um, we do not want you to have, if you will, a settler mentality. And so he dealt with them harshly. And so there was, the King Philip's War. And there was consistent warfare, right? And numerous Native Americans being killed. Some being sent, well, great number being sent out west, or if you will, being eliminated. Um, what was one of the issues with Roger Williams? Well, the major issue with Roger Williams in Massachusetts was religious liberty, but they also had an issue with Roger Williams, excuse me, because of the fact that he wanted to, establish treaties and and negotiations for land. Um, and John Winthrop was like, hey, we're in charge of this. We're not going to do that. We're not going to, if you will, follow. Well, basically, we're in charge, and we will set the terms, and we will change the terms. And these are things that are happening in Massachusetts Bay. And so that is probably the issue that many folks are having. Now, I'm hearing other things too that are probably going even stronger than what I'm putting here. Um, but that is the argument, and I know these days when you say stuff like this, I suppose there's a terminology. Was it? You're being woke if you say it. Also makes me wonder if folks understand what that term meant. To be aware. It's actually a phrase that came up from blues musician in regards to the Scottsboro Boys, long time ago in regards to stay woke. But with that being said, but that's the basic issue in regards to it, as far as I can best gather. Anyway, folks, this is way too long, so I'm going to end it here. Hopefully, you were able to take something from it, and I apologize that it's so long, but that's what you get with a rambling man. All right, y'all, take care.